I'm sorry I cannot be with you in Kiev today, but I'm pleased to participate in the forum through this video. I'm not an expert on the Ukraine, and my background is one of having run an international business producing in 3 different countries for 20 years. Then, for about 25 years, I have been a development economist, so my experience draws on these 2 aspects, business and economic development. And you will probably understand from what I'm saying that I'm not a politician. The Ukraine is in a very difficult position, but not at all impossible. But I think it is a situation where the magic of the market is not going to solve the problems for you. You need a strategy. And what I'm going to talk about is what kind of strategy and based on what theories I think the Ukrainian strategy should follow. I'm afraid that both Russia and Ukraine, each on their own side, are making a mistake by trying to join the club of the rich without thinking about the timing. Russia is trying to join the OECD, and the Ukraine is trying to join the EU. But if you are a poor person, it does not necessarily make you rich that you join a club where many rich countries are members. I think we will see that there are problems in the EU today which will also hit the Ukraine if and when you become a member. I think a critical aspect here is the timing of integration. I'm also happy that my book, How Rich Countries Got Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor, is being published now in the Ukrainian language. The number of languages is now approaching 20, and I think there are some useful messages to be had. These 2 stamps, one issued by East Germany, Communist East Germany, and one by West Germany, shows an unusual situation. Here is an economist, Friedrich List, who is the hero both of the communists and of the West. I think it's important to understand that in terms of economic policy, the European Union has followed 2 very different paths. The first path was from just after World War II up until 1990. This model I call EU Mark I. EU Mark I was based on an understanding of the need to spread industrial production and to control the financial sector. This was the policy of Friedrich List, and it was the policy of the Havana Charter. It was the policy of the Marshall Plan, both from 1947. An example of this EU Mark I policy was the integration of Spain. Spain was integrated into the common market during the 1980s very gradually. Spanish industry got 10 years to get used to a zero tariff. High tariffs were lowered gradually, and there was a plan for Spanish industry, particularly the automotive industry, which was considered very important, to survive. I think the EU Mark I model could be compared to that of a German cartel type of thinking. And the European Steel and Coal Union, which was the basis of the EU, started as a cartel. It started saving and reconstructing the coal and steel industry in Europe after World War II and make sure that this industry survived in all countries. So EU Mark I, it was based on industrial policy. EU Mark II started with the triumphalism after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Before the new periphery of the EU was integrated on May 1st, 2004, these countries had experienced a severe deindustrialization. Perhaps not as bad as Mongolia, where 90% of the industry was gone, but many countries, for instance the Baltic countries, had been seriously deindustrialized. And in my view, the crisis in the EU started with this integration, where someone who was successful in the Baltic countries made €1 an hour, and somebody who was unsuccessful was sweeping the streets of Frankfurt for perhaps €10 an hour. So this asymmetrical integration was, in my view, start of big problems. Examples of this are Latvia, where, according to one version of the last census, more than 20% of the population had left. Another problem is that of Greece, where the deindustrialization is continuing and people have to move. The post-war understanding of economic integration was based on former US President Herbert Hoover's Marshall Plan. Before the Marshall Plan, there had been a Morgenthau Plan, which had the idea of deindustrializing Germany. And this recognition from Hoover lasted all the way through to 1990. Hoover said, "There is the illusion that the new Germany left after the annexations can be reduced to a pastoral state. It cannot be done so unless we exterminate or move 25 million people out of it." So the alternative to reindustrializing Germany was moving 25 million people out of Germany, or exterminate them, as Hoover said. So this was the foundation for the understanding of the need for all industrial countries in the EU to stay industrialized, that deindustrialization was a disaster. That's the logic with which Spain was integrated into the EU, but that is not the logic now. The logic now is such that the understanding of the importance of economic structure is lost, and in my view, the Ukraine risks being in the same situation as Latvia, or perhaps even Moldova, that a main export item becomes its own people. So my recommendation for the Ukraine is that you join the EU like Spain did, in a way that saves industry. And I fully support the intentions and the program of this forum. And I also have some specific recommendations. I think you need a technology policy. The US government has a policy of no policy, but many states in the United States, or cities like Chicago, do have industrial policies. You need to focus on high-tech, but I think you need not to focus on high-tech alone. I would call that, referring to Russia, the Skolkovo syndrome, that you're setting up a high-tech city which has too little linkages to the local economy. I think you need to develop new technology, but I also think you have to use that new technology in marmalade factories, to take an example. That is where employment is created. So I think the high-tech vision must be coupled with a vision to broadly industrialize. I think you have to worry about the relationship between the cost of capital and the cost of labor. A big problem in poor countries is that labor is too cheap and capital is too expensive. In that way, industrialists don't have an incentive to upgrade technologically. I think here is where you need a development bank which can provide inexpensive capital. And I think here Brazil is the best country to emulate. BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank, is said to have more capital than the World Bank, And I think a mission to Brazil to see what they do it and how they do it would be most appropriate. And I think you also need specific targeting of certain industries. Here I think Russia provides one example. For a time after the deindustrialization, which was disastrous in the 1990s, Russia was importing chicken meat from the United States, so-called bush legs, the cheap parts. With a relatively small interference in the market, the Russians managed to create a poultry industry. So I think these are examples of what you should do. You should also look at your import structure, and you should try to develop economic activities where a minimum of incentives produce big results. And I think there are lessons to be learned also from Ukrainian economists. I think Mr. Tugan Baranovsky and his student Nikolai Kondratiev provide an excellent understanding of capitalism, an understanding of capitalism which was compatible to that of German Friedrich List. And I think it's time to go back and rediscover evidence-based economic theory and discard the two static and superficial models which have dominated since 1990. The EU Mark I up until 1990 was a big success. I think the EU after 1990 is growingly becoming a failure. Deindustrialization is a first step towards de-agriculturalization, that agriculture dies, and towards depopulation. I think the link between economic structure and population has to be rediscovered, and I think that what we see internally in the EU, anti-EU parties getting 25% of the vote both in England and in Italy, is a warning sign. The idea that this idea of the European Union is so noble that it cannot fail is wrong. I think it is failing, and I'm afraid that the Ukraine might be joining the EU at the wrong time and too fast. Thank you.